So today we're going to go over everybody's favorite subject, which is soil testing. The reason I say that is because most of the time, every time I've made a soil testing video, it doesn't get a whole lot of views and people don't seem to be very interested in it. But today I want to tell you that the basis to every good lawn is starting with a soil test. And today I'm also going to show you why it's not complicated, why you shouldn't be scared of it, and exactly how you need to perform this test. So I know exactly what you're saying right now, and that's probably that this is all going to be too technical, it's something that I don't want to do. And believe me, I was there when I first started my lawn care journey as well. I thought that this was going to be too complicated for me. I'll just throw down some fertilizer, and why would it really matter? Well, probably the second question that I get most commonly is, what kind of fertilizer should I use, or what should the analysis be? And I really can't answer that question for people until you perform a soil test and know exactly what kind of fertilizer you really should be using on your lawn. But aside from fertilizer, if you learn nothing else from this test, the main thing would be learning the pH of your soil. This is important because I think there are also some other things passed down in lawn care from generation to generation, things like applying lime to your soil, or things that people think that they need to do without ever doing a soil test and knowing for sure. So for example, with that pH, they definitely sell lime at the store around here, and for certain cases it might be necessary, but for most yards around here and my soil specifically, I'm already over a 7 pH. So applying lime to my soil would actually be raising the pH when I want to keep it between 6 and 7 if possible. So without knowing this and without doing that soil test, you don't really have a good sense of what you're actually applying to the yard, whether it's appropriate or if you're actually doing something to go in the direction that you don't want to go, like raise your pH when you actually want to lower it. Beyond pH, this is also going to be able to guide you in terms of what nutrients you need to put down. A few years ago, I learned that I had excessive phosphorus in my soil, so I definitely didn't want to be applying more phosphorus or using a fertilizer that was heavy in that. Now, had I not known, I might just continue on my program, and likely if you have a yard that's been kind of neglected for a while, any fertilizer that you're going to put on it is definitely going to green it up. But when you want to move to that next level, or when certain products just don't seem to be giving you the same types of results anymore, having a soil test, dialing in your nutrients is the answer to that. So today I'm going to be showing you how to take a soil sample, send it to a lab, then I'll definitely show you the results, show you how to at least look at those results, and get a sense of what you need to do with your program. So first off, a couple things that you need. Some gloves. Really the reason is just to protect the samples from anything that might be on your hands. Then I really recommend getting one of these tools. This is a tool that you might not think you're going to need or that you might not use very often, but you're probably going to be surprised over time if you start to get in lawn care that this thing comes in very handy. So I would definitely recommend getting one of these. Just going to make this soil test way easier to collect samples. Of course, you just need some kind of bucket, and then I'm going to be doing a test on both my front yard separate to my backyard. So I just got a couple of bags here, and I run the programs a little differently front to back, so I just like to look at what the nutrients are looking like, see if there's any differences there, and that kind of guides me with that. So for most testing, you're going to want to be at a 6-inch depth. So I have still a little mark here. Last year I put a marker line right on this tool here, so I kind of know where 6 inches of depth is at. And so I'm going to go take my samples, I'm going to put them into here. We're going to take various samples across the yard, so you don't just have one area of soil, but you're going to take some various samples, mix them together. So I'm going to do the backyard here first. So as I mentioned here, there's nothing difficult about this. Got my mark right here, so there you can kind of see what things are looking like for me. And I'm just going to remove this little top piece here, try to get as much of the roots out of there as I possibly can. That's usually where most of your roots are going to lie, in that portion right there. So I'm going to remove that and throw that back out, put my sample in there, then go around the yard, take a bunch more samples in various spots, put that all in here, mix it together, and you'll get a good sample size instead of just one area of your lawn. So I hope you could see how truly easy that was. Now here's what I'm left with. So I'm going to go through these samples, and of course you don't really want to do this when the yard is extremely wet, or these will just be really muddy. But I'm going to go through, try to break this up a little, and if I see any grass or other material in here, as many roots as I can kind of pull out of there, I will do that. But otherwise, this is pretty much all that you have to do. Get all that material out of there as much as possible, and then move to the next step, which will be placing it in your package, labeling it, and filling out a form. That's it. Now from here, I'm simply going to get a bag. You can use some sort of scoop if you'd like. something to get a good sample size in there. And that looks pretty good. So just remember to label this on here with what you're going to call it on the paperwork. So you just want to make sure that you have a label if you're doing a specific spot. If you're just going to do your whole yard, then just label it for your yard, put your label on the paperwork, and you're just going to put it into a box or some sort of envelope, ship that off, and that's going to be the process. If you go to Iowa State University right now, which is local to me, you try to get a soil sample done, they're going to refer you to actually the lab that I'm using. So this is a trusted source, but I'm not getting paid to tell you any of this. I'll list at least a couple labs down in the description that have good reputations for accurate information, and then you can make a decision from there. But for me, this is local to me here, only about 45 minutes away. I get my samples back quickly. The price is very affordable. And of course, as I mentioned, this is what the local university, which has a very good program in agriculture and in turf grass, being here in the middle of Iowa. This is where they're recommending to send your samples, so that's what works for me as well. So today I want to go over some soil testing. Of course, in the first part of this video, I showed you how to take the soil samples and then I got them sent off. And today I want to go through some of the basics here of soil testing and then the report. Ryan, you want to go over sort of for a beginner, if they were looking at this test, what should they be paying attention to?
Well, yeah, the first thing I'm going to always look at is our soil pH, because that's going to really dictate the availability of nutrients that we have in the soil. You know, our ideal range for turf grass is going to be in that 6.5 to 6.9 range. If we get up into 7, that's fine. If we get below that, it's fine too. We can manipulate things. But with your soil pH here at 7.2 in the front yard, again, creeping up a little bit above that number. If that 6.9 is ideal, it's a logarithmic scale. So that sounds like a big fancy word, but it just means that every tenth of a point is actually 10 times difference, right? So we need to be aware of that we're that far above our optimum level. So what that's going to mean here is that some of our nutrients that we see here on this test are less available to the plant. And the first one that comes to mind here is going to be phosphorus. Second one's going to come to mind here is iron. And there's a couple other on here too that I would be concerned with, but not so much as those two, right? So the good news here is that it looks like your phosphorus levels are more than adequate, according to this chart. And I always don't like to go just by the chart. Like, those are there for helpful comparisons and things like that. But the level that we're shooting for here is somewhere above, say, 20 parts per million. With this test, now that'd be a bare minimum. Like, that's the floor of what we want to hit. So again, being up here at 65 parts per million, you're fine. So I think it's going to depend on your pH, depending on if you're a beginning homeowner that's just diving into this and wanting to look at your soil test and what might be your course of action, right? But your pH is going to dictate that, and then it'll help us kind of evaluate some of these macronutrients first and then go from there.
Yeah, and the pH part, I think it's important to recognize that as also the basis of, when someone talks about applying lime to a yard or when would you do something like that, there's a lot of soils that are low on the pH, and that's the case when you would want to be looking at applying something like that. But for me, if I didn't know my soil test and I just, someone told me, oh, you need to apply lime to your yard, I'd actually be looking at raising that pH, and I don't want to raise my pH at all. So it's a definite thing that you want to check there on your pH, and it plays a major role in sort of everything going forward.
No doubt, and I mean, you'll even see that here. Ohio, we definitely have, generally speaking, neutral to alkaline soil. So again, around 7 or slightly above that as a general rule of thumb. And you'll still see lawn care companies offering lime treatments, right? To quote unquote, you'll hear them talk about sweetening the soil, right? And again, without having any basis for a pH level of that particular soil, you wouldn't know if you need to do that or not. So another thing to point out there too, not to get too far in the weeds, but just below that soil pH number, you don't have one because you're alkaline. But if you had acidic soil, they would put a buffer pH in there. And the difference between your soil pH and your buffer pH tells you how resistant your soil is to changing that pH, right? So it'll tell you about how much lime you're going to need to put down relative to what that buffer pH is. So that would be an important thing to know too if you do have acidic soil and you do get a liming recommendation, you'd like to know that buffer pH if at all possible.
So looking at this test then and seeing my pH at 7.2, of course, there are some things that you can try to do to try to lower that even a little more. It was slightly higher in the past, and I think some of the things that I've done with products that I've used, focusing on ammonium sulfate and things like that, have brought it down maybe just a little bit. But what are some things there that people should be looking at if they were in a similar situation to me?
Yeah, so in an alkaline situation, the most easy way to lower soil pH is through the use of elemental sulfur. And this comes in commercially available forms for turf grass. It's no problem to apply, and basically the idea behind it is that essentially with lower rates a couple of times a year, kind of like at the beginning and the end of our growing season, we're able to lower that soil pH using elemental sulfur. Now in your case, at 13 parts per million on your sulfur, we'd like to see that number closer to like 15, maybe even 17 or 18. Given this soil. So again, I could see where not only do you need the sulfur in your soil, because again, it is a vital plant nutrient, but also too from an acidification program perspective, it would be wise to do that too.
Anything else there that you're seeing beyond that in terms of the organic matter there? Or
when we look at organic matter here at 4.6%, that's getting to be pretty high for a lawn. I know that everybody says, the more that you can get, the better, and that's not always the case. So in terms of 4.6%, I'd be looking to manage that down just a skosh if we could. And some different ways to do that. Obviously, there's mechanical means with which to do that. So, core aeration and removing those cores. And either, you're pulling those out and diluting those. The other thing that you can do is sand top dressing, which I know that you're doing in the front yard. And then finally, there's other things you can do from a product standpoint. I know there's certain ones that are marketed as a digester, so to speak, of organic matter. And those are all well and good. The other thing that works really, really well is just plain old blackstrap molasses. So there's different techniques you can use with that particular product as a standalone to help alleviate some of those organic matter concerns.
So I think a natural question there for people would probably be, if your organic matter gets really high, then what are some of the downsides to that, or what are some of the things that you might be seeing as a result of it?
So from a chemical standpoint, we could immobilize some nutrients, right, that might not begin to be plant available if we have too much organic material or organic matter. The other thing that can happen too from a physical side is that we can actually limit the amount of water that's getting into the soil, right? It's gonna act as a water holder to an extent, right? But if we build up a lot of organic matter right at that surface interface between the grass plant itself and then that first interstellar soil, that can be a definite problem. So sampling this and understanding year over year where you're at, and then making these adjustments, I think it'd be really crucial just to understand how much you're driving it up or down based on your management practices. That would be the biggest thing to me.
So then if you want to talk about organic matter, let's take a look at the backyard test here where the number is even higher. And we can kind of see exactly where I was, and sort of, this was my Milo playground, I guess you would say, in my early on years here of adding a lot of Milorganite to that backyard. So it already had a pretty fertile soil back there. Now we're looking at a really high organic matter there. And what are some other things you see just aside from that?
So aside from that, your magnesium to calcium ratio here is off the charts high. So that tells me that, again, not uncommon of a Midwest soil, a very tight soil. So the thing you need to understand about calcium and magnesium in particular is that the overall size of that atom for magnesium is drastically smaller than that of calcium, right? Calcium is a much bigger piece of the puzzle. So as you can imagine, like if I had, let's just say a gallon jug of your soil, and to demonstrate we had maybe 2 or 3 tennis balls, and then the rest were filled with marbles. Those are relative sizes of calcium and magnesium inside the soil. Now imagine if I change that ratio and I put 4 or 5 more tennis balls in there and reduce the amount of magnesium. That's going to be a much more well-drained soil, have better soil tilth, more room for roots, that kind of thing. Okay, so that would be something too that I would be looking to correct. The thing you don't want to get caught up in is how you're going to get that calcium in there. So you might look at the soil and say, oh, 6.9, we're right on the edge here, and The only way I know to get calcium in the soil is through applications of calcium carbonate, which is lime, which is going to raise our pH, and that's not what we want to do. So in this case, the product that we would want to use is a product known as gypsum. Gypsum is a compound that's widely used in a variety of industries, but in turf we use it specifically for this reason, is to supplement available calcium. And it takes a while for this to take place, but we can supplement available calcium to the plant and to the soil and displace some of that magnesium. And by using the gypsum, that will actually knock off excess magnesium and put more calcium into the soil. And again, going back to our analogy here, change our tennis ball to marble ratio in that soil. It's sold as a miracle product sometimes, but all I'm saying is you want it for the calcium, not necessarily for the physical improvements that within that soil.
Yeah, and then I was going to say the only thing that kind of, again, sticks out to me on there is the sulfur being pretty low, at 10 parts per million there.
So again, a 5-pound app is kind of a general rule of thumb that we use. So 5 pounds per 1,000 of elemental sulfur. And if you did that now, before you really get going, that'd be ideal, and then do it later again in the fall. So you really need a good bit of soil moisture, and you need temperatures to start warming up for that to really take effect, but you want to get it down into the soil and working down in there, right? Because all that interaction doesn't need to necessarily happen right at the surface or in that top inch. We want it to work down through and get as deep in the profile as possible. Other than that, manganese, you're okay. And again, it's still tall fescue in the back, so I wouldn't be so worried about these middling manganese numbers. I feel like those are good. Something you want to watch out for, particularly from a cultural standpoint, is if there's certain diseases that manifest in lower manganese soil. So certain patch diseases that we see, particularly on cool season turf.
If you were looking at this as some beginner here and you're looking at some of these numbers and just thinking, I still don't really understand what all this means. Again, look at your pH first, but then your macronutrients, which your nitrogen and your phosphorus and your potassium. This is just a guide here to understand sort of what fertilizers you should be targeting. That's all something that I'll be explaining on the channel, but I think Ryan would probably agree here. Those numbers to start with, as long as you can kind of learn what might be low there and start to dial that in, instead of, again, you might be using a product that has a bunch of phosphorus in it and you look at a test like this and you say, oh, I already have way too much, I shouldn't be doing that. It's not like you're ruining anything, but at the same time, you can get a much better plan going when you just understand some of the basics here of what you're seeing on this test.
No question. And again, those three numbers on the bag, NPK, right across the front, left to right. Nitrogen is going to drive the bus on all of this because nitrogen is the most used nutrient in the plant, right? So the demand for all these others is dictated by how much nitrogen gets up into the plant. So if you start there and have a good plan with nitrogen, and you'll notice that it's not actually measured or reported on this test. And part of the reason is that it's so volatile in the soil in terms of the levels of it and what's going on with organic matter and creating more nitrogen and things like that, that they don't measure it because it's not an accurate snapshot in time to give us actionable data from. And so far as looking at these tests, look, Ryan, let's just take yours as an example. If I'm looking at the front yard here, again, fine on phosphorus. Let's just focus on NPK. Let's not worry about micros. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking a 1-to-1 nitrogen to potassium. And all that means, folks at home, is that the first number on the bag and the third number on the bag, we want to get those as close as we can. You're not always going to be likely to find it in a big box, but you can certainly seek out what they have available that's got that highest K number and then work from there.
Again, these are just the basics of looking at this test, looking at your pH, looking at some of those macros, and understanding that there's a roadmap here that you can follow. It's not all going to happen overnight. It's not something you need to be completely freaked out about by any means, but at least you'll have a good idea of where to go once you get this test back.
Absolutely. And I think you're right that soil pH first. If you can get that corrected, that's going to help. I don't like using the word unlock because it's not necessarily the best word to use, but it will help your plant better access what is in that soil, right? And then go from there. And then from that point, addressing your organic matter if it is too high. And again, we talked about some of those strategies to kind of try and combat that, and some things to be careful on. And then lastly, the piece that isn't on here, the nitrogen piece, is trying to work on that and do the best you can with that first, and then let these other things start to fall in line as you get more comfortable and confident with using fertilizers and understanding how to manipulate your program to get the most out of it based on your soil test.
Thanks so much again, Ryan, for joining me. Thank you everyone for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time.